Eleanor Whitaker's hands trembled as she watched her grandmother's veil rip apart between Margaret Hale's fingers, 6 months of restoration work destroyed in 11 seconds. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply watched, memorizing every face that laughed. Because somebody was coming for this family, and Eleanor intended to remember exactly who deserved what was about to happen to them. If you believe quiet women remember everything, subscribe and stay until the end. Comment the city you're watching from. I read every single one. A sharp, tearing crack that split through the upstairs chamber of the Hale estate like a rifle shot, fired too close to the ear. Eleanor Whitaker did not scream. She stood perfectly still in the center of the room, her hands still raised in the position they had been in a moment before, reaching toward the veil that no longer existed as anything whole. Margaret Hale held one half of it. Lydia Hale held the other. Between them, in shredded ribbons of ivory silk and hand-stitched colonial lace, lay 6 months of Eleanor's life. "Oh," Margaret said, tilting her head as though admiring a piece of art she had just finished rather than destroyed. "Did that mean something to you?" Eleanor's mouth opened, but no sound came. The veil had belonged to her grandmother, then to her mother. It had crossed the Atlantic, folded inside a cedar chest, had survived a house fire. In Massachusetts, had been carried through 3 generations of Whitaker women who had nothing else of value to pass down except thread and memory. Eleanor had spent half a year restoring it, stitch by aching stitch, late into the night after long days working in Philadelphia's textile houses, because she could not afford a seamstress, and because some things a woman had to repair with her own hands, or they did not count. "You're still a miller's daughter playing dress-up," Lydia said, dropping her half of the veil onto the floor, as though it were nothing more than a soiled rag. "Did you really believe Jonathan's family was going to let you wear something so common down our aisle?" Eleanor looked down at the fabric scattered across the polished wood floor. She did not move to pick it up, not yet, because something inside her chest had gone very quiet, very still. The kind of stillness that came right before a storm broke, not after it had passed. "Why?" Eleanor said finally, her voice low and steady. "Would you do this?" Margaret laughed, a short, sharp sound, utterly without warmth. "Because you needed to understand something before you walked down those stairs today, Eleanor. This family does not bend for outsiders. It never has." "I am not an outsider," Eleanor said. "I am marrying your brother." "You are marrying into something," Lydia corrected, stepping closer, close enough that Eleanor could smell the rosewater on her skin, the expensive kind, the kind Eleanor's mother had never once been able to afford. "And things that don't belong tend to get removed." The threat sat plainly in the air between them, unmasked, unapologetic. Eleanor's eyes moved from Lydia's face to Margaret's, then down again to the ruined silk at her feet. She thought of her mother's hands guiding hers as a child, teaching her how to thread a needle without pricking her fingers. She thought of her grandmother's voice, worn thin with age, telling her stories about the ship crossing, about the cedar chest, about how a Whitaker woman never let anyone see her break. She thought of all of it, and she felt something crack open inside her chest that was not grief. It was clarity. "You didn't do this because you think I'm beneath your family," Eleanor said quietly. "You did this because you're afraid I'm not." Margaret's smile faltered just slightly, just for a heartbeat. "Excuse me, if I truly meant nothing," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining steadiness with each word, "you would have ignored me. Women like you don't waste effort destroying things that don't threaten you." The silence that followed was different from the one before, sharper. Margaret's jaw tightened. "Get out of my sight," she snapped suddenly, losing the composed cruelty she'd worn moments before. "The wedding starts in 2 hours. I suggest you find something else to wear, Miss Whitaker, since you clearly can't be trusted to keep nice things intact." Lydia laughed at that, a high, cold sound, and the two sisters swept from the room in a rustle of expensive silk, leaving the door open behind them, as though Eleanor wasn't even significant enough to warrant the courtesy of being shut in or shut out deliberately. Eleanor stood alone. For a long moment, she simply breathed. Then she knelt slowly and gathered the ruined fragments of the veil into her arms, the way someone might gather the pieces of something far more alive than fabric. Her fingers traced over the torn lace edges, the places where careful stitches had once held together generations of women who had survived far worse than two spoiled sisters and a wedding gone wrong. She did not cry. She had promised herself somewhere on the long carriage ride from Philadelphia to this Virginia estate 3 weeks ago that she would not give the Hale family the satisfaction of her tears. Whatever they did, whatever they said. She intended to keep that promise. The door creaked. Eleanor looked up to see Jonathan Hale standing in the doorway dressed in his wedding clothes, his cravat slightly askew, as though he'd been rushing. For a moment, hope flickered in her chest. Small, stubborn, foolish hope that he had come because he'd heard, because he understood, because he was about to do something that would prove all the doubt she'd been suppressing for months was misplaced. Then his eyes landed on the veil in her hands, and his face shifted into something closer to discomfort than outrage. "Eleanor," he said carefully. "What happened?" "Your sisters happened," she said. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he did not move closer. He stayed exactly where he was framed in the doorway, as though some invisible line kept him from crossing fully into the room, into her grief. "They tore it," Eleanor said, holding up the largest remaining piece. "On purpose, while I watched." "Eleanor, this was my grandmother's," she continued, her voice cracking now, despite her best efforts, the careful composure she'd built, finally splintering. "It crossed an ocean. It survived a fire. It is the only thing of value my family has ever owned, and your sisters tore it apart like it was nothing because I am nothing to them." Jonathan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. A gesture Eleanor recognized, the gesture he made whenever he was trying to manage a problem rather than feel it. "We cannot turn this into a scene today," he said. "Not with the guests arriving, not with my father's business partners watching every detail of this wedding." Eleanor stared at him. "A scene?" she repeated. "You know how my family is." Jonathan continued, his voice taking on the placating tone she had heard him use on his mother, on difficult clients, on anyone he needed to manage rather than truly engage. "Margaret and Lydia can be difficult, I know that, but—" "Difficult," Eleanor said. "Is that what we're calling this? It's just fabric, Eleanor." Jonathan said it gently, as though he were being kind by saying it, as though he believed this was the comforting thing to offer her. "We can commission another veil. There's a seamstress in Boston who does excellent restoration work. I'll send for her myself. I promise you'll have something even more beautiful for the actual ceremony. It's not just fabric. I know it means something to you, but in the larger picture—" "Stop," Eleanor said. The single word landed heavily in the room, and Jonathan actually stopped, startled by the sharpness in her voice. Eleanor set the remains of the veil down gently on the dressing table beside her, smoothing the torn lace with careful fingers, even though there was no saving it now, simply because her hands needed something gentle to do while the rest of her was shaking apart. "You keep saying, 'in the larger picture,'" she said slowly. "As though my grandmother's memory, my mother's hands, 6 months of my own labor restoring something irreplaceable, as though all of that is a small, inconvenient detail standing in the way of your family's perfect wedding day. That's not what I—" "Then tell me what you meant, Jonathan." Eleanor turned to face him fully now, and something in her posture had changed, straightened, hardened, in a way that made him take an involuntary step backward. "Tell me you understand why this matters. Tell me you're angry on my behalf. Tell me you intend to walk into that hallway right now and tell your sisters that what they did was cruel and unacceptable." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Too long. "Eleanor," he finally said, "you have to understand the position I'm in. My father's entire business depends on the alliance this wedding represents. The shipping contracts, the land negotiations, Margaret and Lydia, whatever their faults, they are still my sisters. I cannot simply—" "You cannot simply defend me," Eleanor said flatly. "That's what you're telling me." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." The silence between them stretched heavy and final, and Eleanor felt something settle inside her chest. Not anger, though anger was certainly present, burning low and steady beneath her ribs. What she felt was closer to understanding. the terrible clarifying understanding of finally seeing something she had spent months refusing to see. "You don't see me," she said quietly. "Not really. Not as someone whose work has value, whose family has history, whose grief is worth defending. You see me as a complication to be managed, a scene to be avoided, an inconvenience standing between you and a smooth afternoon." "That is not fair," Jonathan said, but there was no real conviction in his voice, and they both seemed to hear it. From the hallway outside, footsteps approached, and Margaret's voice carried clearly through the open door, pitched deliberately loud enough to be heard. "Jonathan, the minister has arrived. Are you finished placating the help?" Eleanor watched Jonathan's face, watched the flicker of something, shame perhaps, or simple exhaustion, cross his features before he straightened his shoulders and turned toward the door. "I have to go," he said. "We'll discuss this properly after the ceremony, I promise you. Please, Eleanor, just get dressed. The guests are already arriving." He left. He did not look back. Eleanor stood alone in the room once more, surrounded by ruined silk, and understood with absolute clarity that the man she had agreed to marry had just chosen his sister's comfort over her dignity, and had done so without even appearing to notice he'd made a choice at all. Eleanor sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, the torn veil still spread across the dressing table where she'd laid it. Her mind drifted backward, unbidden, to 2 years ago, to the first time she had met Jonathan Hale. She had been working in a Philadelphia textile restoration shop, carefully repairing a damaged tapestry that had belonged to one of the city's oldest families, when Jonathan had walked in beside his father to discuss commissioning new draperies for their townhouse. He had noticed her hands first, the careful, precise movements as she worked the needle through delicate fabric, and then he had noticed her face when she looked up, startled by his attention. "You have remarkable skill," he had said, genuinely impressed, leaning over to examine her work more closely. "I've never seen anyone restore antique lace with such precision." Eleanor remembered the warmth that had spread through her chest at his words. Not because he was handsome, though he was, and not because he was wealthy, though that mattered too in ways she was not proud of, given her family's circumstances, but because he had seen her. Truly seen the skill in her hands, the years of practice, the quiet pride she took in work most people considered beneath notice. For months afterward, he had returned to the shop under increasingly transparent pretenses, commissioning small repairs he did not need, asking her opinion on fabrics he had already chosen, finding reasons to extend conversations that had no practical purpose beyond simply being near her. "You're different from the women in my social circle," he had told her once during a carriage ride through Philadelphia's busier streets. "They talk about fashion as though it were a competition. You talk about it like it's history, like every thread tells you something about the people who came before." "It does," Eleanor had said, "if you know how to listen to fabric." He had looked at her then with an expression she had mistaken in her naivety for permanence, for certainty. She understood now, sitting amid the ruins of her grandmother's veil, that what she had mistaken for love had perhaps only ever been curiosity, fascination with something different from his ordinary world. A novelty that had charmed him precisely because it was foreign to everything he'd known, until that novelty became inconvenient, until it required him to choose between comfort and conviction. And when that moment arrived, as it just had, he had chosen comfort. Eleanor closed her eyes and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of grief. 30 seconds to mourn the version of this day she had imagined, the version where someone fought for her, where someone's loyalty did not bend the instant it became costly. Then she opened her eyes, and the grief receded behind something colder, more useful. She stood. She walked to the dressing table. She picked up the largest remaining fragment of the veil, the section bearing the most intricate lace pattern. The pattern her grandmother had once told her represented wheat stalks, a symbol of harvest, of survival through hardship, and she folded it carefully, deliberately, and tucked it into the small traveling bag she had brought with her 3 weeks ago. She would not wear a veil today. She would walk into that ceremony with nothing covering her face, nothing hiding her expression, and she would let every single person in that estate see exactly what had been done to her, and exactly how little it had broken her. The hallway outside her chamber buzzed with the controlled chaos of wedding preparations, servants carrying flowers, distant voices calling instructions, the muffled sound of a string quartet, tuning their instruments somewhere below. Eleanor descended the staircase slowly. Her chin lifted, her hands steady, despite everything trembling beneath her composed exterior. She wore a simple ivory dress, not the elaborate gown the Hale family had insisted upon, the one with too much lace and too many layers that had made her feel like she was drowning in fabric every time she'd tried it on. She had chosen instead a dress of her own design, simpler, sharper, the kind of dress that did not apologize for the body wearing it. At the bottom of the stairs, Mrs. Hale, Jonathan's mother, stood waiting, her expression already arranged into the particular brand of disapproval Eleanor had grown accustomed to over the past 3 weeks. "Where is your veil?" Mrs. Hale demanded, scanning Eleanor's bare head with visible distaste. "Ask your daughters," Eleanor replied evenly. "They seem to have strong opinions about it this morning." Mrs. Hale's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I'm sure whatever happened was simply a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Eleanor repeated. "Is that what we're calling deliberate destruction of a family heirloom?" "Eleanor." Mrs. Hale's voice carried the warning tone of someone accustomed to ending conversations with a single word. "This is not the time." "You're right," Eleanor said. "It's not. But I imagine there will be a time, Mrs. Hale, and when it arrives, I don't believe your family will enjoy the conversation nearly as much as you've enjoyed humiliating me these past 3 weeks." She did not wait for a response. She walked past Mrs. Hale toward the estate's main hall, where guests had already begun arriving in carriages, where the summer afternoon sun filtered through tall windows onto polished floors that smelled of fresh flowers and old money, where her wedding, or what remained of it, was about to unfold in front of dozens of witnesses who had no idea what they were truly about to see. In the main hall, the guests had gathered in clusters of expensive silk and murmured conversation. Eleanor recognized several faces from Philadelphia society business associates of the Hale family, distant relatives who had traveled considerable distances for an event that was supposed to cement 2 powerful families together. She positioned herself near the side entrance, watching the room with the detached clarity of someone observing a scene from a great distance, even as her body remained physically present within it. Margaret approached her first, her expression a mask of false concern that did not reach her eyes. "No veil?" Margaret asked, her voice pitched just loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "How unfortunate. Though perhaps it's for the best. Some traditions simply aren't meant for everyone. Some traditions," Eleanor said calmly, "are meant for people who understand the value of what they're destroying." Margaret's smile flickered. "I beg your pardon." "Nothing," Eleanor said. "Enjoy the ceremony, Margaret." She walked away before Margaret could respond, leaving the other woman standing alone, with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and unease, as though she'd expected tears, expected fragility, expected the satisfying collapse of someone she'd successfully wounded, and instead found something far more unsettling: a woman who had already moved past the wound entirely. Near the back of the hall, away from the gathering crowd, Eleanor found a moment of solitude beside a tall window overlooking the estate's gardens. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and allowed herself finally to feel the full weight of everything that had happened that morning. The veil. Jonathan's silence. His mother's dismissal. Margaret's cruelty wrapped in false sympathy. 3 weeks she had endured this family's quiet campaign of erasure-delayed invitations, meant to humiliate her in front of Philadelphia society servants who conveniently failed to follow her instructions. Gifts mysteriously replaced with cheaper, inferior versions that made it appear she had poor taste. She had told herself each time that dignity meant silence, that rising above their cruelty meant refusing to acknowledge it, that Jonathan would eventually see the pattern, would eventually choose to protect her the way a husband should protect his wife. She understood now how foolish that hope had been. Through the window she watched carriages continuing to arrive, watched well-dressed guests stepping down onto the gravel drive, watched the entire elaborate machinery of wealth and status assembling itself for a ceremony that was supposed to represent love, but had from the very beginning represented something far more transactional, an alliance between shipping fortunes and landowning families, with Eleanor herself serving as nothing more than an unwelcome variable in an equation that had never truly included her humanity. "You look troubled." Eleanor turned to find an older woman standing nearby, someone she did not recognize from the earlier introductions, dressed in traveling clothes rather than wedding finery. Simpler, more practical attire that suggested she had arrived for reasons other than celebration. "Forgive me." The woman continued, noticing Eleanor's confusion. "I'm not here for the wedding exactly. My name is Mrs. Aldridge. I'm acquainted with your work, Miss Whitaker, the restoration you did on the Bennington Tapestry collection. Remarkable craftsmanship." Eleanor blinked, surprised. "You know my work?" "I know it well enough to recognize that the woman who restored century-old colonial textiles with such precision deserves rather better treatment than what I've witnessed in this house over the past hour." Eleanor said nothing, uncertain how to respond to such direct acknowledgement from a stranger. "I have connections in Washington." Mrs. Aldridge continued, her voice lowering slightly. "Colleagues who take historical preservation rather seriously. If half of what I overheard about that veil is true, an authenticated colonial-era textile deliberately destroyed, that's not merely a family squabble, my dear. That's a matter that extends well beyond this estate's walls." Before Eleanor could ask what she meant, the sound of the string quartet shifted, signaling the ceremony's imminent beginning, and Mrs. Aldridge offered a small knowing smile before melting back into the crowd of gathering guests. Eleanor stood alone again, turning the strange encounter over in her mind, wondering exactly what Mrs. Aldridge had meant. Wondering with the first flicker of something that might have been hope, whether the destruction of her grandmother's veil might prove far more consequential than the Hale family had ever imagined. The ceremony space had been arranged in the estate's grand drawing room, rows of polished chairs facing an arch decorated with summer flowers, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Virginia countryside beyond. Eleanor stood at the entrance waiting for her cue, watching Jonathan take his position at the altar beside the minister, watching him adjust his cravat nervously, watching him avoid meeting her eyes even from across the considerable distance separating them. Margaret and Lydia sat in the front row beside their mother, their expressions composed now into appropriate wedding solemnity, as though they had not spent the morning shredding an irreplaceable heirloom in front of the bride. The music began. Eleanor felt her feet move forward one careful step after another down the makeshift aisle between rows of curious guests who whispered behind gloved hands about the missing veil, about the rumors already spreading through the gathered crowd regarding some unpleasant incident upstairs. She kept her chin lifted. She kept her eyes forward. She refused to let a single one of them see anything resembling shame. Halfway down the aisle, she caught Jonathan's eyes for the first time since their conversation in the chamber upstairs. What she saw there was not love. It was relief. Relief that she had appeared at all. Relief that she had not caused the scene. He so desperately feared relief that whatever damage had been done to her dignity that morning had apparently not been severe enough to derail his family's carefully orchestrated alliance. Eleanor understood in that single exchanged glance precisely how little she had ever truly mattered to him, beyond her usefulness in completing this transaction. She reached the altar. She stood beside him. The minister began the opening words of the ceremony, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before, oblivious to the quiet devastation occurring directly in front of him. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered here today." The sound of carriage wheels on gravel interrupted him. Not the gentle, expected sound of a latecomer arriving for the ceremony. Something heavier, more numerous. The unmistakable rhythm of multiple carriages arriving simultaneously, accompanied by the sound of horses being reined in sharply, urgently outside the estate's main entrance. Whispers rippled through the gathered guests. Heads turned toward the windows. The minister paused, uncertain, glancing toward the Hale family for guidance. Mrs. Hale's composed expression flickered for the first time that day into something resembling genuine concern. Through the tall windows, Eleanor could see figures dismounting from the carriages outside, men dressed not in wedding finery, but in formal coats, bearing the unmistakable insignia of federal authority, moving with the deliberate purpose of men who had not traveled this distance for celebration. The estate's front doors opened. Footsteps echoed through the grand hallway approaching the drawing room, with unhurried but undeniable authority. Every guest in the room turned toward the entrance. The ceremony forgotten entirely, as the doors swung open to reveal a tall man in a dark federal coat, his expression carrying the weight of someone who understood precisely the significance of what he was about to disrupt. He scanned the room slowly, his eyes moving across the gathered guests, across the flowers and the polished chairs, and the elaborate symbols of wealth surrounding him, until his gaze finally settled on Eleanor, standing frozen at the altar. Then his eyes moved downward to her bare head, to the absence of the veil that should have been there. "Miss Whitaker," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I understand there's been an incident this morning involving a registered colonial textile artifact." Eleanor felt her heart stop. Mrs. Hale rose from her seat. "I'm sorry, but who exactly are you, and what gives you the authority to interrupt a private family ceremony?" The man turned toward her, unbothered by the challenge in her voice. "Marshal Gideon Carter," he said simply. "Federal authority acting on a report filed regarding the deliberate destruction of a protected historical artifact." Margaret's face went pale. Jonathan turned slowly toward Eleanor, confusion and dawning alarm spreading across his features. "Eleanor," he whispered. "What did you do?" Eleanor met his eyes, and for the first time that entire devastating morning, she felt something close to peace settle into her chest. "I didn't do anything," she said quietly. "I simply told the truth to someone who was willing to listen." Marshal Carter did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The weight in his tone alone was enough to hold the entire drawing room frozen. 50-some guests suspended mid-breath, the minister's prayer book still open in his hands, as though he had forgotten how to close it. "Mrs. Hale," Carter said, turning his attention fully toward Jonathan's mother, who stood rigid beside the front row of chairs. "I'll need a moment of everyone's patience while we sort through what occurred in this house earlier today." "This is a wedding," Mrs. Hale said, her voice climbing toward something brittle. "Whatever paperwork concern you believe you have can certainly wait until—" "It can't," Carter said simply. 2 words, no explanation offered. The kind of flat, immovable authority that made even Mrs. Hale's protest die somewhere in her throat. Eleanor stood at the altar, her hand still technically resting near Jonathan's arm, though neither of them had moved in over a minute, and she felt the entire architecture of the morning shifting beneath her feet, not dramatically, not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet, devastating certainty of ice cracking under careful weight. Margaret had gone very still in the front row. Lydia's eyes darted toward her sister, then toward their mother, then toward the door as though searching for an exit that did not exist. "Miss Whitaker," Carter said, addressing Eleanor directly, now his voice gentling slightly, though losing none of its authority. "I received a report this morning concerning a registered colonial-era textile, a wedding veil specifically documented as part of the Eastern Seaboard Heritage Preservation Rolls. Can you confirm whether such an item was in your possession?" Eleanor's mouth went dry. She had not filed any report. She had told no one beyond Jonathan and his family about the veil's history, about its documentation, about the fact that 3 years ago, struggling to fund repairs on a textile she could not bear to lose, she had registered it with a Historical Preservation Society in Boston in exchange for a small restoration grant, a registration she had nearly forgotten about entirely until this very moment. "Yes," she said slowly. "It was my grandmother's veil. I registered it for preservation funding several years ago." "And where is that veil now?" The room seemed to hold its breath collectively. Eleanor felt every eye shift toward her, toward Margaret, toward the tension crackling between them like static before a storm. "It was destroyed this morning," Eleanor said, deliberately. Margaret shot to her feet. "That is not. She's exaggerating. It was an accident, a simple misunderstanding between—" "Sit down, Margaret," Carter said, without even turning to look at her. Something in his voice made Margaret's legs fold automatically back into her chair, the color draining from her face as she realized, perhaps for the first time, that whatever leverage her family's wealth typically provided did not extend to federal authority standing in her brother's wedding. Mrs. Aldridge. Carter continued gesturing toward the back of the room. Filed the initial report not 2 hours ago. She indicated she'd witnessed the aftermath and overheard several details suggesting deliberate destruction rather than accident. Eleanor turned startled, searching the crowd, until she found the older woman she had spoken with near the window, Mrs. Aldridge, who now stood near the entrance with her hands folded calmly in front of her, offering Eleanor the faintest knowing nod. So that was what she had meant. I have connections in Washington. Eleanor had assumed it was simply kindness, simply sympathy offered by a stranger who recognized her work. She had not understood until this exact moment that Mrs. Aldridge had meant something far more literal, that the woman had walked directly from their conversation to file an official report with federal authorities before the ceremony had even begun. This is absurd, Mrs. Hale said, her composure cracking further with each passing second. A torn veil is hardly a federal matter. Surely this can be resolved with some manner of fine, some... Mrs. Hale? Carter interrupted his patience, visibly thinning. The item in question was formally registered as a protected historical artifact under federal preservation statute. Its deliberate destruction is not a private family matter to be smoothed over with money. It is a violation of federal law. The words landed like a physical blow. Jonathan, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, finally found his voice. Marshal Carter, surely there's been some confusion. This is my wedding day. Whatever occurred this morning was a minor disagreement between my sisters and my bride. Nothing more. Was the veil destroyed, Mr. Hale? Carter asked, turning his sharp attention onto Jonathan now. A simple yes or no will suffice. Jonathan hesitated. Eleanor watched him hesitate, watched the calculation happening visibly behind his eyes, watched him weigh loyalty to his family against the plain, undeniable truth standing directly beside him. Yes, Jonathan finally admitted quietly. It was destroyed. By whom? Silence stretched. Margaret's hands had begun trembling in her lap. By my sisters, Jonathan said the words, seeming to cost him something physical, some deep reluctance dragging against every syllable. Margaret and Lydia. Lydia made a small strangled sound of protest, but no actual words emerged. Carter nodded slowly, as though confirming something he'd already suspected, and reached into his coat to produce a folded document, official and severe-looking, even from across the room. Then I'm afraid, he said, the two of you will need to accompany me for formal questioning regarding the deliberate destruction of federally protected property. The drawing room erupted. Guests who had been sitting in stunned silence suddenly found their voices, whispers exploding into open conversation, gasps and murmured speculation rippling through the rows of expensive silk and polished shoes. This is preposterous, Mrs. Hale shouted over the rising noise, finally abandoning all pretense of composure. My daughters are not criminals. This is clearly some manner of misunderstanding, some bureaucratic overreach. Mrs. Hale, Carter said, his voice cutting through the chaos with the ease of someone accustomed to commanding rooms far more hostile than this one, I'd recommend you secure legal counsel for your daughters rather than continue arguing with federal authority in front of 50 witnesses. That silenced her. Eleanor stood frozen at the altar, watching the entire elaborate machinery of the Hale family's confidence crumbling in real time, watching Margaret's face shift from outrage to genuine fear, watching Lydia begin to cry. Not from remorse, Eleanor suspected, but from the sudden terrifying realization that consequences existed for people like her after all. This is your doing, Margaret hissed, twisting in her seat to glare directly at Eleanor. You did this. You planned this from the very beginning, didn't you? Pretending to be some humble little seamstress while secretly plotting to destroy our family? Margaret, Carter said sharply. Another outburst like that, and I'll add obstruction to the list of concerns I'm bringing back to Washington. Margaret's mouth snapped shut, though her eyes remained locked on Eleanor with an expression of pure, undisguised hatred. Eleanor met her gaze steadily, refusing to look away. refusing to offer even the smallest flicker of the satisfaction Margaret seemed desperate to extract from her. "I didn't plan anything," Eleanor said quietly, though her voice carried clearly through the suddenly hushed room. "I simply told the truth when someone finally asked." The ceremony, such as it had been, dissolved entirely within minutes. Guests began rising from their seats in confused clusters, some hurrying toward the exits to avoid association with whatever scandal was unfolding, others lingering near the edges of the room, unable to look away from the spectacle of one of Virginia's most prominent families crumbling in real time. Marshal Carter's deputies, two younger men who had entered alongside him, equally formal in their federal coats, moved efficiently through the chaos, positioning themselves near Margaret and Lydia, with the quiet, unmistakable purpose of men prepared to enforce whatever orders their superior gave. "Eleanor," Jonathan said finally, turning to face her. Fully, his expression a tangled mess of confusion, fear, and something that might have been desperate hope that she would somehow fix this for him. "You have to tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them it was an accident. Please." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "I won't lie for your family, Jonathan. They're going to arrest my sisters. They destroyed something irreplaceable," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the storm raging beneath her composed exterior. "Something that belonged to my grandmother. Something I spent 6 months restoring with my own hands. And you stood in that room this morning and told me it was just fabric." Jonathan flinched as though she'd struck him. "I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said," Eleanor interrupted. "And now you're asking me to lie to federal authority to protect the same people who tore apart everything I had left of my family, simply because protecting them is more convenient for you than protecting me ever was." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and final. Jonathan's face crumbled slightly, something genuine finally breaking through his careful composure. "Eleanor, please. If they're charged, if this becomes public, my father's business will be ruined. Everything my family has built should have been considered," Eleanor said. "Before your sisters decided destroying my grandmother's veil was an acceptable way to spend their mourning." She turned away from him, then walking toward the side of the room where Mrs. Aldridge stood watching the unfolding chaos with calm, measured interest. "You filed the report," Eleanor said quietly, once she'd reached the older woman's side. "Why?" Mrs. Aldridge studied her for a moment before answering. "Because I've spent 30 years watching families like the Hales believe their wealth places them above consequence. Because I recognized your restoration work the moment I saw mention of it in the Preservation Society's records, painstaking, meticulous, the kind of work that deserves protection, not destruction, at the hands of careless, cruel women who've never had to earn anything in their lives. You knew who I was before today. I'd heard your name mentioned among preservation circles," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Talented restorers are rare, Miss Whitaker. The kind who treat fabric like it's carrying actual memory rather than mere decoration, that's rarer still. When I overheard what happened to your veil this morning, I recognized immediately that this wasn't simply a family dispute. It was destruction of something registered, something protected, something that deserved federal attention, regardless of whose wedding it interrupted." Eleanor felt something unexpected rise in her chest, not quite gratitude, not yet the morning's devastation, still too raw for anything so generous, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. The strange, disorienting experience of being seen clearly by a stranger, after months of being systematically erased by people who claimed to love her. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Mrs. Aldridge replied, her eyes drifting toward where Carter stood speaking with his deputies. "This is only the beginning of what's about to unfold. Families like the Hales don't simply accept consequences gracefully. You should prepare yourself for what comes next." What came next arrived within the hour in the form of Hale family lawyers, summoned urgently from Richmond, men in expensive coats who arrived breathless and harried, immediately attempting to negotiate with Marshal Carter in hushed, urgent tones near the estate's entrance. Eleanor watched from a distance, standing near the gardens outside, finally permitted a moment of solitude. After hours of chaos questions and the suffocating attention of guests who could not seem to look away from the unraveling spectacle. "They're trying to make this disappear," came a voice beside her. Eleanor turned to find Jonathan approaching his wedding finery, now rumpled, and his expression carrying the exhausted weight of someone who had spent the past hour fighting battles on multiple fronts simultaneously. "I imagine they are," Eleanor said. "My father's lawyers believe they can negotiate a settlement, pay restitution for the veil, make a generous donation to the Preservation Society, and the whole matter quietly disappears without formal charges." "And what do you believe?" Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gardens rather than at her. "I believe," he finally said, "that I should have defended you this morning. I believe I made a terrible mistake choosing my family's comfort over your dignity, and I don't know how to undo that now." Eleanor studied his profile, the genuine regret etched into his features, and felt something complicated stirring beneath her own carefully maintained composure. "You can't undo it," she said simply. "Some choices don't allow for undoing, Jonathan. They simply reveal who you actually are." "So that's it then. After everything, after 2 years, you're simply finished with me." "I'm not finished with anything," Eleanor said. "I'm finally seeing clearly. There's a difference." Before Jonathan could respond, raised voices erupted from near the estate's entrance. Margaret's voice, sharp and desperate, cutting through the afternoon air. "You cannot simply take us away like criminals. Do you have any idea who my father is? The connections he has in Richmond and Washington?" "Ma'am," came Carter's deputy's voice, flat and unmoved. "Those connections won't change federal statute. Please step into the carriage." Eleanor and Jonathan both turned to watch as Margaret and Lydia were escorted toward a waiting carriage, their wedding-appropriate finery now looking absurdly out of place against the grim formality of federal custody. Margaret caught sight of Eleanor watching from across the gardens, and even at that distance, the venom in her expression was unmistakable. "This isn't over," Margaret called out, her voice carrying across the lawn. "You'll regret this, Eleanor Whitaker, I promise you that." Eleanor said nothing in response. She simply watched with quiet, steady eyes as the carriage doors closed, and the horses began pulling away down the long gravel drive, carrying 2 of the women who had spent 3 weeks trying to erase her dignity toward whatever consequences awaited them in Richmond. The remaining guests had largely dispersed by late afternoon, the elaborate wedding preparations now standing abandoned, and absurd, untouched cake wilting flowers, chairs arranged for a ceremony that would never reach its conclusion. Eleanor found herself alone in the estate's gardens as evening approached, the summer air finally cooling after the suffocating heat of the day's events. When Marshal Carter approached, his federal coat now slightly loosened his expression, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent hours navigating both legal complexity and aristocratic outrage. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "a moment of your time if you don't mind." "Of course. I wanted to clarify something for you directly, rather than leaving you to hear it through rumor or family lawyers attempting to minimize the situation." Eleanor straightened slightly, bracing herself for whatever news he carried. "The veil you registered," Carter continued, "wasn't simply documented as a historical curiosity. Our Preservation Society's records indicate it contained colonial-era lace patterns specifically cataloged as part of an at-risk textile collection, patterns believed lost after several similar pieces were destroyed during various estate fires throughout the past century." "I didn't realize it carried that level of significance," Eleanor admitted. "Most people don't," Carter said. "Which is precisely why deliberate destruction of such items carries serious federal weight, regardless of who commits the act or how wealthy their family happens to be." "What happens now to Margaret and Lydia?" "That depends on several factors," Carter said. "Whether you choose to press for full prosecution, whether you're amenable to a restitution arrangement, whether the Preservation Society wishes to make an example of this case to discourage similar destruction in the future." Eleanor considered this for a long moment, watching the evening light filtering through the garden's carefully manicured trees. "What would you recommend?" she finally asked. Carter studied her for a moment before answering. I don't typically offer personal opinions on cases I'm investigating, Miss Whitaker. But I will say this in my experience, women in your position rarely have anyone advocating fully for their interests in situations like this. Families like the Hales possess resources, connections, the ability to make uncomfortable situations simply disappear through money and influence. You, however, hold something they desperately want right now. What's that? Get mercy, Carter said simply. Or the absence of it. The choice of how thoroughly this becomes public, how severely it impacts their family's reputation and business dealings, rests substantially in your hands. Eleanor turned this information over carefully, feeling the weight of unexpected power settling onto shoulders that had spent the entire morning believing themselves utterly powerless. I need time to consider, she said. Take whatever time you need, Carter replied. Though I'd recommend not taking too long. Families like the Hales tend to move quickly once they sense an opportunity to minimize damage. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in the small guest chamber she had occupied throughout her 3-week stay at the Hale estate, surrounded by the few belongings she had brought with her, staring at the torn fragment of her grandmother's veil that she had carefully preserved earlier that morning. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Mrs. Hale standing in the hallway, her composed elegance from earlier in the day now replaced with something far more desperate, far more human. "May I come in?" Mrs. Hale asked. Eleanor hesitated, then stepped aside. Mrs. Hale entered slowly, her eyes drifting toward the fragment of torn lace resting on the bedside table, something flickering across her expression that might have been genuine regret or might simply have been calculated performance. "I won't pretend my daughters didn't do something cruel this morning," Mrs. Hale said. "They did. I should have controlled them better, should have anticipated their resentment running this deep." "But," Eleanor prompted, sensing the inevitable qualification approaching, "but I'm asking you as one woman to another to consider mercy. My daughters were foolish, jealous, cruel, but they're not criminals deserving of federal prosecution that could follow them for the rest of their lives. Margaret has a young son. Lydia is engaged to be married next spring. Whatever happens here will follow them. Will follow this entire family for years to come." Eleanor studied the older woman carefully, recognizing the genuine fear beneath her composed plea. Not fear for Eleanor's well-being, never that, but fear for the family's reputation, for the social standing that had taken generations to build. "Your daughters destroyed something irreplaceable," Eleanor said quietly. "Something that meant more to me than anything I've ever owned. And not one person in this family, not you, not Jonathan, not Margaret or Lydia, offered a single moment of genuine remorse until federal authority arrived and made consequences unavoidable." "I understand your anger." "I don't think you do," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady, but carrying an edge of finality. "I don't think anyone in this family has ever truly understood what it means to have nothing to build something precious from nothing, and to watch people who have everything destroy it simply because they could." Mrs. Hale was quiet for a long moment. "What will you do?" she finally asked. Eleanor looked toward the window, toward the darkening Virginia sky, and felt the weight of the decision settling fully onto her shoulders for the first time. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I know this much: I won't decide based on what's convenient for your family. I've spent 3 weeks making myself smaller, quieter, more accommodating to protect everyone's comfort except my own. That ends today." Mrs. Hale's composure finally cracked entirely, tears welling in eyes that had remained dry and dismissive throughout the entire devastating day. "Please," she whispered. "I'm begging you, Eleanor. Whatever you think of us, whatever we deserve, my daughters are still my children." "And my grandmother's veil," Eleanor said quietly, "was still irreplaceable." She moved toward the door gently but firmly, indicating the conversation had reached its conclusion. Mrs. Hale lingered for a moment longer, then finally departed, leaving Eleanor alone once more with her thoughts, with the torn fragment of lace, and with the decision that would determine not only the fate of the Hale daughters, but the entire trajectory of her own uncertain future. Late that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor wandered down to the estate's empty drawing room, where remnants of the abandoned wedding still lingered, wilted flowers, and untouched cake chairs, arranged for guests who had long since departed. She found Jonathan sitting alone near the cold fireplace, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand, his expression carrying the particular emptiness of someone confronting the full consequences of choices made hours earlier. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, not looking up as she entered. "No. My father returns tomorrow morning from his business trip in Richmond," Jonathan said. "He doesn't yet know what happened today. I'm not entirely certain how to explain it to him." "Perhaps simply tell him the truth," Eleanor suggested. "That his daughters destroyed something precious and consequences finally arrived for behavior that's apparently gone unchecked for years." Jonathan finally looked up at her, something raw and exhausted in his expression. "I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about me not truly seeing you." Eleanor said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch between them. "You were right," Jonathan continued. "I think I loved the idea of you, your talent, your difference from everyone else in my social circle, the way you made me feel like I was choosing something authentic, rather than simply continuing my family's expected path. But when it mattered, when actually defending you required risking my family's comfort, I failed you completely." "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "You did. Is there any way to fix this between us?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, searching herself for any remaining flicker of the hope she had once carried so confidently into this engagement. She found very little. "I don't think so," she finally said. "Not because I can't forgive imperfection, Jonathan. Everyone fails sometimes. But because what happened today wasn't a single failure, it was the final, undeniable confirmation of a pattern I'd been ignoring for months. You will always choose your family's comfort over my dignity when it truly matters. I can't build a life with someone who's already shown me that truth so clearly." Jonathan absorbed this in silence, his shoulders slumping further with each passing second. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "But I know I won't be staying in this house any longer than necessary." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, looking back at the man she had once believed she would spend her entire life beside. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I do believe you're capable of genuine remorse, Jonathan. I simply don't believe remorse alone is sufficient to undo the damage already done." She left him alone with his brandy and his regret, walking back through the darkened hallways of the Hale estate toward her temporary chamber, carrying with her the torn fragment of her grandmother's veil and the absolute certainty that whatever came next in her life would not include returning to the comfortable erasure she had endured for the past 2 years. The following morning arrived with unexpected visitors. Eleanor was packing her few belongings into her traveling case when a sharp knock interrupted her preparations. She opened the door to find Marshall Carter standing in the hallway, accompanied by a younger woman Eleanor did not recognize, dressed in simple but well-tailored traveling clothes. "Miss Whitaker," Carter said. "I apologize for the early hour, but circumstances have developed rather quickly overnight that require your immediate attention." "What circumstances?" "This is Miss Caroline Webb," Carter said, gesturing toward his companion. "She represents the National Textile Preservation Office in Washington. News of yesterday's incident traveled faster than anticipated, and apparently your situation has attracted considerable interest." Caroline Webb stepped forward, extending her hand with brisk efficiency. "Miss Whitaker, I won't waste your time with excessive formality. Your restoration work has been discussed within preservation circles for some time now. The Bennington tapestries, several pieces from the Charleston Historical Society. When word reached our office that a registered colonial artifact had been deliberately destroyed by the very family attempting to absorb you into their social circle, several of my colleagues found the situation rather compelling, beyond simply its legal implications." Eleanor stood frozen, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "Compelling in what sense?" she asked carefully. "Our office has been searching for a skilled restoration specialist to oversee a significant new initiative," Caroline continued. "Cataloging and preserving textile artifacts from the early Republic period before further pieces are lost to neglect fire, or—" Her eyes flickered briefly toward the direction of the main estate. Deliberate destruction. We believe your skill combined with your evident dedication to preserving family heritage, despite considerable personal cost, makes you precisely the candidate we've been seeking. Eleanor's breath caught. You're offering me a position? I'm offering you the opportunity to discuss one formally in Washington, Caroline clarified. Though I'll be direct, Miss Whitaker, given everything I've learned about yesterday's events, and given the quality of work I've personally examined from your portfolio, I anticipate that conversation concluding rather favorably for both parties. Eleanor looked between Caroline Webb's confident expression and Marshall Carter's steady, encouraging nod, feeling something shift fundamentally within her chest. Not quite hope, not yet the previous day's devastation, still too raw for anything so unguarded, but something adjacent to possibility. I would need to consider the practical details, Eleanor said carefully. Housing compensation, the scope of responsibilities. Of course, Caroline said. Nothing needs deciding this instant, but I'd encourage you to travel with us to Washington, regardless of your final decision. At minimum, you deserve to see what genuine appreciation for your work actually looks like, rather than continuing to seek it from people who've demonstrated repeatedly they're incapable of providing it. Eleanor glanced back toward her small traveling case, half-packed with the meager belongings she had brought to this estate 3 weeks earlier, believing she was beginning a new life as Jonathan Hale's wife. She thought of her grandmother's voice, worn thin with age, telling stories about resilience, about survival, about Whitaker women who never let circumstance determine their worth. She thought of the torn veil fragment carefully preserved among her belongings, no longer simply a symbol of loss, but perhaps now something closer to a beginning. "Give me 20 minutes, Eleanor said, and I'll be ready to leave." 20 minutes turned into nearly an hour, not because Eleanor hesitated, but because word of her departure had spread through the estate faster than anyone anticipated, and by the time she descended the staircase with her traveling case in hand, Mr. Hale himself had returned from Richmond, his face carrying the particular fury of a man who had walked directly into a scandal he hadn't authored. "Miss Whitaker," he said, intercepting her at the bottom of the stairs before she could reach the front entrance. "A word, if you please." Eleanor stopped, setting her case down beside her feet. "Mr. Hale, I understand there's been considerable upheaval in my absence." His voice carried the controlled, measured tone of a man accustomed to negotiating shipping contracts, treating this entire devastating affair as though it were simply another deal requiring careful handling. "My daughters have been taken into federal custody. My son's wedding has collapsed entirely. And now I'm told you're departing for Washington with representatives from some preservation office I've never heard of." "That's an accurate summary," Eleanor said. "I'd like to propose a resolution." Mr. Hale continued, stepping closer, his expression shifting into something more conciliatory, more practiced. "A generous settlement. Compensation for the veil for your distress, for the disruption to your reputation. In exchange, you withdraw your cooperation with the federal investigation and allow this entire unfortunate matter to be resolved privately." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "How generous?" she asked. Something flickered in Mr. Hale's eyes, relief perhaps mistaking her question for the opening note of negotiation. $5,000, he said. "Paid immediately in full, with no conditions beyond your silence and your withdrawal of cooperation." $5,000. More money than Eleanor's family had seen across 3 generations combined. Enough to purchase a home outright, to never again worry about the precarious finances that had defined her entire upbringing. For one disorienting moment, she felt the genuine pull of it, the practical, exhausted part of her that had spent years counting coins, mending torn fabric, not for love of the craft, but for desperate necessity, wondering whether dignity was truly worth more than security. Then she thought of Margaret's cold smile as she tore the veil apart, of Lydia's casual cruelty dragging her fingers through delicate lace like it was nothing more than refuse, of Jonathan's voice saying, "It's just fabric," as though 6 months of her labor, 3 generations of her family's history, meant absolutely nothing in the face of his comfort. "No," Eleanor said. Mr. Hale blinked clearly, unprepared for refusal. I beg your pardon. I said no. Eleanor repeated, her voice steady, despite the considerable sum still echoing tantalizingly in her mind. Your money doesn't restore what your daughters destroyed, Mr. Hale. And it certainly doesn't restore the dignity your entire family stripped from me over these past 3 weeks. 10,000 then. His voice carried an edge of desperation, now the careful businessman's composure cracking slightly. This is a generous offer, Miss Whitaker. More generous than you'll ever see again in your lifetime. You misunderstand me, Eleanor said. This was never about money. Then what is it about? Mr. Hale demanded, his frustration finally breaking through entirely. What exactly do you want from my family? Eleanor considered the question seriously, allowing herself a moment to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. I want your daughters to understand that destroying something simply because they're wealthy enough to believe they can doesn't make them untouchable, she said finally. I want them to learn, even if only once, that consequences exist, regardless of family name or social standing. They're young women, Miss Whitaker. They made a foolish mistake. They made a deliberate choice, Eleanor corrected. There's a difference. Mr. Hale's jaw tightened, his composure finally abandoning him entirely. You'll regret refusing this offer. The legal proceedings ahead will be lengthy, exhausting, and far less profitable than the settlement currently sitting on the table. Perhaps, Eleanor said, but at least I'll be able to look at myself honestly when it's finished. She picked up her traveling case and walked past him toward the entrance where Marshall Carter and Caroline Webb waited beside the carriage that would carry her toward Washington and whatever uncertain future awaited there. The carriage ride toward Washington stretched across 2 full days, the Virginia countryside rolling past in long stretches of summer green farmhouses and tobacco fields, giving way gradually to the increasingly dense traffic surrounding the growing capital. Eleanor spent much of the journey in contemplative silence, watching the landscape shift, feeling the strange, disorienting sensation of leaving behind everything she had believed her future would contain. You're quiet, Caroline Webb observed during their second day of travel, seated across from Eleanor in the swaying carriage. I'm trying to understand what just happened to my life, Eleanor admitted. 3 days ago, I believed I was marrying into security, into a future where I wouldn't need to worry about money or status, or whether my family's history mattered to anyone beyond myself. And now I'm traveling toward an uncertain position with strangers carrying nothing but a torn fragment of my grandmother's veil, and considerably less certainty than I had a week ago. Caroline studied her for a long moment. May I offer some perspective, Miss Whitaker? Eleanor nodded. What you call uncertainty, Caroline said, I'd call possibility. The security you believed you'd found with the Hale family was never truly secure. It depended entirely on your willingness to make yourself smaller, quieter, more accommodating to people who fundamentally despised your presence among them. That's not security. That's a slow, gradual erasure dressed up as stability. Eleanor absorbed this in silence, feeling the truth of it settle uncomfortably beneath her ribs. What you're walking toward instead, Caroline continued, is genuine opportunity. A position where your skill is recognized rather than tolerated, where your history matters rather than embarrasses, where you'll be surrounded by people who understand precisely why preserving a single piece of colonial lace carries significance far beyond its physical thread count. You make it sound almost romantic, Eleanor said, a small surprised smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. Preservation work often is, Caroline replied, though perhaps not in the conventional sense you've been taught to expect. Washington, when they finally arrived, struck Eleanor as a city still defining itself. Grand government buildings rising amid construction scaffolding, broad avenues that seemed almost too wide for the modest traffic currently using them, the unmistakable sense of a capital still growing into the ambitions its architects had imagined for it. The National Textile Preservation Office occupied a modest brick building near the city's center, considerably less grand than Eleanor had imagined, but carrying an atmosphere of purposeful activity that felt immediately different from the suffocating formality of the Hale estate. "Miss Whitaker," came a voice as she stepped through the entrance, and Eleanor turned to find an older gentleman approaching, his hands stained faintly with what appeared to be dye or pigment, his expression carrying genuine warmth rather than practiced courtesy. "I'm Director Thomas Ashford. I've heard a great deal about your work over the past day." "All of it accurate, I hope," Eleanor said. Ashford laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound. "More than accurate. Miss Webb shared details of the Bennington restoration with several of our senior staff yesterday evening, and I confess we spent considerable time examining the documentation rather than attending to more pressing matters." He led her through the building, past rooms filled with careful, methodical work, textiles laid out across long tables, staff bent over magnifying glasses, examining delicate threads, the entire space humming with quiet, dedicated purpose. "This is remarkable," Eleanor said, unable to keep the wonder from her voice, as she observed the careful, reverent handling of fabric pieces clearly centuries old. "It's necessary work," Ashford replied. "Our nation is young. Miss Whitaker still defining its own history, even as that history risks disappearing through neglect fire, and—" his expression turned somber, "as you experienced firsthand sometimes deliberate destruction by those who fail to understand its value." He gestured toward a small office near the back of the building. "Shall we discuss the position properly?" The conversation that followed unfolded with a directness Eleanor had not experienced in months, perhaps years. Ashford laid out the position's responsibilities with careful precision, overseeing restoration projects across the eastern seaboard, training junior restorers in techniques Eleanor had developed through years of independent practice, cataloging at-risk textiles, before further pieces were lost to the same careless destruction that had claimed her grandmother's veil. "The compensation," Ashford continued, sliding a document across the desk toward her, "reflects the seniority of the position, along with housing allowance given your relocation requirements." Eleanor examined the figures, feeling something close to disbelief settle through her chest. The salary alone exceeded anything she had imagined earning through restoration work, more than double what she had made working independently in Philadelphia, accompanied by housing that would eliminate the precarious financial existence that had defined her entire adult life. "This seems remarkably generous," she said carefully. "It reflects your value," Ashford replied simply. "Talented restorers capable of your level of precision are exceedingly rare, Miss Whitaker. We've struggled for nearly 2 years to fill this position adequately. Your work on the Bennington tapestries alone demonstrates skill we simply cannot afford to lose to private commissions when national preservation efforts require exactly your expertise." Eleanor stared at this document, feeling the full weight of the offer settling into something that felt almost too significant to be real. "I accept," she said finally. Ashford smiled warmly. "Excellent. Though I should mention, given the circumstances surrounding your departure from Virginia, several newspapers have already begun inquiring about the incident. The destruction of a registered colonial artifact by a prominent shipping family carries considerable public interest, particularly given the timing alongside what would have been your wedding." Eleanor's stomach tightened. Public interest. "I'm afraid the story has already begun circulating," Ashford said gently. "Marshall Carter's involvement, the federal charges against Margaret and Lydia Hale, the abandoned wedding itself. These details have proven rather irresistible to journalists covering both legal affairs and society gossip." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this new complication. "What does this mean for me?" she asked. "It means," Ashford said carefully, "that you may find yourself somewhat more visible than anticipated over the coming weeks. The Preservation Society itself stands to benefit from increased public attention to historical artifact protection, but I won't pretend the personal scrutiny will be entirely comfortable." The scrutiny arrived faster than Eleanor anticipated. Within 3 days of her arrival in Washington, newspapers across the eastern seaboard had picked up variations of the story, some sympathetic framing Eleanor as a wronged bride whose dignity had been violently stripped away by a cruel, wealthy family. Others, considerably less generous, suggesting she had somehow orchestrated the entire scandal to extract herself from an engagement she'd grown tired of, or worse, implying she'd deliberately sought federal intervention to damage the Hale family's reputation out of spite. "Don't read them," Caroline Webb advised. Finding Eleanor seated alone in the preservation office's small library, several newspapers spread across the table in front of her, her expression carrying visible distress. "How can I not?" Eleanor asked. "They're discussing my life as though it's entertainment for strangers' breakfast conversations. Because that's precisely what scandal becomes for people removed from its actual consequences," Caroline said, settling into the chair beside her. "But the opinions of strangers reading newspapers over their morning coffee don't define your reality, Eleanor. Your work does. Your character demonstrated through actual choices, rather than speculation does." Eleanor pushed the newspapers aside, feeling exhausted by the relentless attention. "I never wanted any of this," she admitted. "I simply wanted my grandmother's veil restored properly. I wanted a quiet life, a stable marriage, perhaps eventually a small workshop of my own, where I could continue this work without depending on anyone else's approval." "Sometimes," Caroline said gently, "circumstances force us toward lives considerably larger than the ones we originally imagined for ourselves." A week into her new position, Eleanor received an unexpected letter, the handwriting immediately recognizable, despite months of separation. She opened it with trembling hands, finding Jonathan's familiar script filling several pages, his words carrying an urgency she had not heard from him since their earliest courtship. "Eleanor, I understand I have no right to write to you after everything that's happened, after everything I failed to do when it mattered most. But I find myself unable to remain silent while watching newspapers twist your character into something unrecognizable, while my own family continues attempting to paint you as some calculating villain, rather than acknowledging the cruelty that drove this entire situation. I testified yesterday before the preliminary hearing regarding Margaret and Lydia. I told the complete truth about the veil, about their deliberate destruction of it, about my own failure to protect you when you needed defending most. My father is furious. My mother hasn't spoken to me since. I don't expect this letter to change anything between us. I understand perhaps more clearly now than ever before that what we had cannot simply be repaired through apology alone. But I needed you to know that I'm finally doing what I should have done from the very beginning, choosing what's right over what's comfortable. I hope Washington brings you everything Virginia failed to provide. Jonathan. Eleanor read the letter twice. Feeling a complicated tangle of emotions, she struggled to fully untangle. Relief that he had finally testified. Honestly lingering hurt that it had taken federal intervention to force that honesty. And underneath both a quiet, surprising sense of closure she hadn't expected to feel so completely. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, recognizing it for what it was. Not an invitation to reconciliation, but simply an acknowledgement, finally, of truth that should have been spoken weeks earlier. The preliminary hearing for Margaret and Lydia Hale concluded 3 weeks later, the verdict arriving via official correspondence delivered directly to Eleanor's small Washington apartment. She read the document, slowly absorbing each careful legal phrase. Both sisters had been found guilty of deliberate destruction of federally protected property. Rather than imprisonment, the court had imposed substantial fines alongside mandatory community service, specifically working under direct supervision within historical preservation efforts for a period of 2 years. Learning firsthand the value of the heritage they had so carelessly destroyed, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and something closer to bittersweet resolution reading the verdict. Not quite vindication, not entirely justice in the way she might have once imagined wanting, but something that felt appropriately proportional to what had actually occurred. "How do you feel?" Caroline asked, finding Eleanor still holding the letter that evening, staring out the window of the small apartment the preservation office had arranged for her. "Strange," Eleanor admitted. "I spent weeks wanting them to understand consequence, wanting them to feel even a fraction of the powerlessness I felt watching them destroy something irreplaceable. Now that it's happened, I feel less triumphant than I expected." "Justice rarely feels triumphant," Caroline observed. It simply feels necessary. The satisfaction when it comes tends to arrive later gradually as you watch yourself building something new from what remained after the destruction. Eleanor considered this watching evening settle over the unfamiliar Washington streets outside her window. I think, she said slowly, I'm finally ready to begin building that. Eleanor's first major restoration project at the National Textile Preservation Office arrived within her second month of employment, a collection of early Republic-era garments salvaged from a Charleston estate that had suffered significant fire damage, the pieces requiring careful, methodical restoration before irreplaceable historical detail was lost entirely. She threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised even her senior colleagues, spending long hours bent over delicate fabric. Her hands moving with the same careful precision she had once applied to her grandmother's veil, except now surrounded by colleagues who understood implicitly why such precision mattered. You have remarkable instincts, Ashford observed one afternoon, watching her carefully reconstruct a damaged embroidery pattern that had stumped two previous restorers. How did you develop such intuitive understanding of period-appropriate techniques? My grandmother taught me, Eleanor said. She used to say that fabric remembers everything, every hand that touched it, every moment it witnessed, every story woven into its construction. You simply have to learn how to listen carefully enough to hear what it's telling you. That's a beautiful philosophy, Ashford said. It's also practical, Eleanor replied. Understanding the emotional weight behind a piece often reveals technical details about its construction that pure academic study sometimes misses. Ashford studied her with renewed appreciation. I believe, Miss Whitaker, that you may prove to be precisely the kind of director this office requires for its expanding restoration efforts. Eleanor's hands paused mid-stitch. Director, our current restoration director plans retirement within the coming year, Ashford explained. Given your demonstrated skill, along with the genuine philosophy you bring to preservation work, I believe you'd be exceptionally well-suited to assume that position when the opportunity arrives. Eleanor absorbed this unexpected possibility, feeling something unfamiliar bloom within her chest. Genuine professional ambition, separate entirely from any relationship or marriage or social standing she had once believed defined her worth. I would be honored to be considered, she said. Months passed, the Washington seasons shifting from summer's oppressive heat through autumn's gradual cooling. Eleanor settling into a rhythm of meaningful work and growing professional recognition that felt entirely foreign compared to the precarious existence she had known in Philadelphia or the suffocating erasure she had endured during her brief engagement to Jonathan Hale. She received occasional updates regarding the Hale family through Preservation Society colleagues who maintained connections throughout Virginia society, news that Mr. Hale's shipping business had suffered considerable reputational damage following the scandal that several business partners had quietly withdrawn from previous agreements once the federal case became public knowledge, that Margaret and Lydia's mandatory community service had proven considerably more humbling than either sister had anticipated. Jonathan, she learned, had relocated entirely to Boston, distancing himself from his family's diminished social standing in Virginia, apparently attempting to rebuild some independent reputation separate from the scandal that had consumed his family's name. Eleanor felt surprisingly little when receiving this information, not satisfaction exactly, nor genuine sympathy, but a quiet, settled neutrality that felt like genuine healing rather than suppressed resentment. You seem different lately. Caroline observed one evening the two women sharing dinner at a small restaurant near the preservation office, a friendship having developed naturally between them throughout the preceding months. Different how? Lighter, Caroline said. Settled somehow, in a way you weren't when you first arrived here. Eleanor considered this, recognizing the truth in Caroline's observation. I think, she said slowly, I spent so many years believing my worth depended on whether someone else recognized it. Whether Jonathan saw me clearly, whether his family accepted me, whether marriage into their social standing would finally make me feel secure and valued. I never considered that I might find that security and value through my own work, my own choices entirely separate from anyone else's approval. That's precisely what genuine independence feels like, Caroline said, raising her glass slightly in a small private toast. Took you long enough to discover it. Eleanor laughed genuinely, for what felt like the first time in months. As autumn deepened toward winter, Eleanor received word that Marshal Carter would be passing through Washington on official business, accompanied by an invitation to dinner extended through Ashford's office. She accepted, curious about the man whose intervention had so dramatically altered the trajectory of her entire life. They met at a modest restaurant near the preservation office, Carter appearing considerably more relaxed than the formal authoritative figure who had interrupted her wedding months earlier. "Miss Whitaker," he greeted warmly. "I confess I've followed your progress with considerable interest since our last meeting. I owe you a debt I'm not certain I can adequately repay," Eleanor said. "If Mrs. Aldridge hadn't filed that report, if you hadn't arrived when you did, I'm not certain what my life would look like today." "Mrs. Aldridge deserves the credit," Carter said. "I simply responded to a legitimate report regarding federal property destruction. Though I'll admit the circumstances surrounding that particular case proved considerably more compelling than typical preservation violations I usually investigate." "How so?" Carter studied her for a moment before answering. "Most cases I investigate involve simple negligence, families failing to properly store or protect historical items through carelessness rather than malice. Your situation was different. Deliberate destruction witnessed firsthand occurring specifically because two women resented your presence in their family. That kind of calculated cruelty deserved more than a simple, fine, and quiet resolution. You could have allowed the Hale family's lawyers to negotiate a private settlement," Eleanor observed. "Many federal authorities might have accepted that resolution rather than pursuing formal prosecution." "I could have," Carter agreed. "But I've spent considerable years watching wealthy families believe themselves immune to genuine consequence, watching their lawyers negotiate away accountability through generous settlements that conveniently silence anyone inconvenient enough to demand actual justice. I found myself unwilling to allow that pattern to continue unchallenged in your particular case." Eleanor felt something warm and grateful settle through her chest. "Why my case specifically?" Carter considered the question seriously before answering. "Perhaps because watching you stand at that altar bareheaded after your veil's destruction, refusing to show the satisfaction your tormentors clearly wanted to extract from you. That struck me as someone who deserved an advocate willing to ensure her dignity received proper protection, even when her own fiancé apparently couldn't be bothered to provide it." Eleanor felt unexpected emotion rising in her throat. Gratitude mixing with lingering hurt from Jonathan's failure, all of it tangling together into something she struggled to fully articulate. "Thank you," she finally managed, "for seeing what needed protecting, even when everyone closest to me failed to recognize it." "You're entirely welcome, Miss Whitaker," Carter said, his expression carrying genuine warmth. "Though I suspect, given everything you've built here in Washington over these past months, you would have found your way toward exactly this success regardless of my involvement. I simply helped clear away obstacles that never should have existed in the first place." Carter's words stayed with Eleanor long after he departed Washington, settling into something she carried quietly through the following weeks. As winter arrived in earnest frost, gathering on the office windows each morning, the Preservation Society's workload shifting toward indoor restoration projects that kept her hands busy and her mind mercifully occupied. She had nearly convinced herself the Hale family belonged entirely to her past, a closed chapter. Painful but finished when the letter arrived that shattered that fragile peace entirely. It came not from Jonathan, not from Mrs. Hale, but from a Richmond attorney. Eleanor had never heard of the formal letterhead, immediately setting her nerves on edge before she'd even broken the seal. "Dear Miss Whitaker, I write on behalf of Margaret Hale Pearson regarding matters arising from her completed community service obligations. Mrs. Pearson wishes to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss a matter of considerable urgency concerning your testimony during the original federal proceedings." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her stomach tightening with each pass. Margaret Hale Pearson. Married apparently in the months since Eleanor had last seen her, though married to whom the letter didn't specify, and the omission felt deliberate, somehow calculated to reveal as little as possible, while demanding everything. What could she possibly want? Caroline asked that evening, reading the letter over Eleanor's shoulder, in the small apartment they now shared, Caroline having moved in months earlier when her own lodging arrangement fell through. I don't know, Eleanor admitted. But I don't trust it. Margaret never did anything without calculating exactly what she stood to gain. You don't have to respond, Caroline pointed out. You completed your obligations as a witness. The case concluded months ago. Whatever she wants now isn't your responsibility. Eleanor stared at the letter, feeling old instincts warring against newer ones. The instinct toward silence and avoidance that had defined her 3 weeks at the Hale estate, and the harder-won instinct toward direct confrontation that Washington had taught her to value. I think I need to hear what she has to say, Eleanor finally said. If only to finally close this completely, rather than wondering for years what unfinished business still lingers. The meeting took place 2 weeks later in a private parlor at a modest Washington hotel, Margaret having traveled from Richmond specifically for the purpose, accompanied by her attorney and, surprisingly, her younger sister Lydia. Eleanor arrived with Marshal Carter at her side, not officially, not in any federal capacity, but simply as a friend whose presence she had requested, uncertain what manner of confrontation awaited her, and unwilling to face it entirely alone. Margaret looked different than Eleanor remembered, thinner. Perhaps the careful composure she'd once worn like armor, now replaced with something more brittle, more exhausted. Miss Whitaker, Margaret said, rising as Eleanor entered. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Your letter mentioned urgency, Eleanor said, taking the seat across from her, declining the false pleasantries that had once governed every interaction between them. I'd appreciate you explaining what exactly requires such urgency, given that our last conversation ended with federal charges and considerable animosity. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly, but she nodded, accepting the directness without protest. My husband, she began, discovered the details of what happened in Virginia shortly before our wedding. The federal case, the community service, all of it. He'd known some surface details naturally. It was hardly possible to keep something so public entirely secret. But the full scope, the deliberate cruelty involved, he learned only recently. And, Eleanor prompted, and he's threatening to leave me, Margaret said, her voice cracking slightly despite obvious effort to maintain composure. He says he cannot remain married to someone capable of such calculated viciousness, someone who destroyed an innocent woman's family heirloom simply from jealousy and cruelty. Eleanor felt no immediate sympathy, though she recognized the genuine distress in Margaret's voice. What exactly do you want from me? Eleanor asked. A letter, Margaret said quickly, leaning forward with sudden urgency. Something stating that the destruction was accidental, that I've shown genuine remorse, that you've forgiven me entirely. Something I can show my husband, something that might convince him to reconsider. Eleanor sat back, absorbing the audacity of the request. You want me to lie, she said flatly. Again, for your benefit. I'm not asking you to lie about everything, Margaret said desperately. Simply to soften certain details. To suggest the cruelty was less calculated than it appeared. It was entirely calculated, Eleanor said. You stood in that room and told me I was a miller's daughter pretending to be a lady. You smiled while tearing apart something that represented 3 generations of my family's history. There was nothing accidental about your cruelty. Margaret and I won't lie to protect you from consequences you created entirely through your own choices. Lydia, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice considerably more subdued than Eleanor remembered from their previous encounter. We've changed, Lydia said quietly. The community service working alongside actual preservation experts, seeing firsthand what we destroyed and why it mattered, it changed how we understand what we did. Eleanor studied the younger sister carefully, searching for genuine remorse beneath the desperate circumstances driving this meeting. Perhaps you have changed, Eleanor acknowledged. But Margaret's request isn't about genuine remorse, Lydia. It's about damage control. She wants me to lie so her marriage survives, regardless of whether that lie accurately reflects what actually happened. Please, Margaret said, tears finally breaking through her careful composure. I'm begging you, Eleanor. I know I don't deserve your help. I know what I did was cruel beyond reasonable excuse. But my marriage, my entire future, is being threatened by the consequences of your own actions. Eleanor finished. Not by mine. I didn't destroy your marriage, Margaret. You did the moment you chose cruelty over basic human decency. The room fell silent, tension stretching uncomfortably between them. There's something else, Margaret said finally, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. Something I haven't told anyone yet. Not my husband. Not my attorney. Not even Lydia. Eleanor felt herself tense, sensing the conversation about to shift into territory she hadn't anticipated. What is it? Margaret hesitated, glancing nervously toward Carter, toward Lydia, before finally meeting Eleanor's eyes directly. The veil, she said slowly. It wasn't simply jealousy that drove me to destroy it. There was another reason. What reason? Margaret's hands trembled visibly, now her composure entirely abandoned. My mother asked me to do it. The words landed like a physical blow, the room going utterly silent as Eleanor absorbed this unexpected revelation. What? Eleanor finally managed. My mother, Margaret repeated. She'd discovered something about your family's history, something she believed would embarrass our family if it became public knowledge before the wedding. She told me to find a way to drive you away before the ceremony, to make the engagement collapse without her fingerprints being directly involved. Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her entire understanding of that devastating morning. What did she discover? Margaret glanced toward her attorney, who nodded slightly, apparently having already been briefed on this revelation. Your father, Margaret said carefully. He wasn't simply a textile craftsman who fell on hard financial times as you'd always believed. My mother discovered records suggesting he'd been involved in some manner of financial fraud. Years before your birth, falsified business documents, debts left unpaid across several Massachusetts townships before he relocated and changed his surname entirely. Eleanor's breath caught painfully in her throat. That's not possible, she whispered. My father was an honest man, a hard-working craftsman who changed his name from Whitcomb to Whitaker shortly before your birth. Margaret interrupted gently, though there was no genuine gentleness in delivering such devastating information. My mother's investigators uncovered the records months before the wedding. She panicked, believing the connection to our family's business reputation, should it become public, would prove catastrophic to our father's shipping contracts. Eleanor sat frozen, feeling decades of assumed family history crumbling beneath this unexpected revelation. So she instructed you to destroy my veil, Eleanor said slowly, piecing together the calculated cruelty with new devastating context. Not simply from jealousy or class prejudice, but specifically to drive me away before the truth about my father could become public knowledge and somehow connect back to your family's reputation. Yes, Margaret confirmed quietly. And Jonathan? Did he know? No, Margaret said quickly. Jonathan knew nothing about this. My mother kept the information entirely between herself and me, believing I would simply manufacture some other reason for our cruelty that wouldn't reveal her actual motivation. Eleanor turned toward Carter, searching his expression for guidance through this sudden, overwhelming complication. Is this verifiable? She asked him directly. These claims about my father. Carter's expression carried careful neutrality, though Eleanor could see him processing the legal implications rapidly. If such records exist, they could certainly be investigated. Though I'd caution against accepting Mrs. Pearson's account without independent verification, particularly given her evident motivation for sharing information that might somehow shift blame away from her own deliberate cruelty. Why are you telling me this now? Eleanor asked Margaret directly. What do you gain from revealing your mother's involvement? Margaret's expression turned bitter, something genuine finally breaking through her desperate performance. Because she's the one who should have faced consequences, not me. I was simply following her instructions, terrified of disappointing her, terrified of losing my place within this family if I refused. She manipulated me into destroying your veil while remaining entirely protected from any federal investigation herself. That doesn't excuse what you did, Eleanor said. You chose to obey her instructions. You chose the manner of cruelty, the specific words you used while tearing apart something irreplaceable. Your mother's manipulation doesn't erase your own agency in carrying out that destruction. I know, Margaret whispered. I know that now, but I needed you to understand the full truth, regardless of what it means for my own circumstances. Eleanor left the meeting hours later, her mind reeling from the unexpected revelation, Carter walking silently beside her through Washington's darkening streets as she struggled to process everything she'd learned. Do you believe her? Carter finally asked. I don't know what to believe anymore, Eleanor admitted. Everything I thought I understood about my own family history, about my father's past, about the actual reasons behind that morning's cruelty, it's all suddenly uncertain. We can investigate the claims about your father, Carter offered. If records exist regarding a name change, regarding alleged fraud in Massachusetts federal archives, should be able to confirm or deny their existence relatively quickly. And if it's true, Eleanor asked, her voice carrying genuine fear now. If my father truly committed fraud, changed our family's name to escape consequences, built our entire identity on a foundation of deception. Carter considered the question carefully before answering. Then you'll need to decide how that information changes your understanding of your own history, Eleanor. But I'd remind you, whatever your father may or may not have done decades before, your birth doesn't define your own character, your own choices, your own demonstrated integrity throughout this entire ordeal. Eleanor absorbed this feeling, some measure of calm return amid the storm of uncertainty. I need to know the truth, she finally said, regardless of what it reveals. The investigation took nearly 3 weeks. Carter, utilizing federal resources to trace records across Massachusetts townships, eventually uncovering documentation that painted a considerably more nuanced picture than Margaret's dramatic revelation had suggested. Your father's situation was more complicated than either fraud or innocence, Carter explained, meeting Eleanor in the preservation office's private study to deliver his findings. He did change his surname from Whitcomb to Whitaker. That part is accurate. But the circumstances weren't criminal fraud exactly. Then what were they? Your father co-signed a business loan with his own father, your grandfather, to expand their textile operation in Massachusetts. When the business failed due to circumstances largely outside their control, an economic downturn affecting the entire textile industry throughout that region, your grandfather fled the resulting debt, entirely abandoning your father to face creditors alone. Eleanor felt something complicated stirring in her chest. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent to understanding. Your father, Carter continued, spent years working to pay back what he could of the debt, though the full amount proved impossible given his limited resources. Eventually, facing continued harassment from creditors who refused to distinguish between his debt and his father's abandonment, he relocated to Philadelphia and adopted his mother's maiden name, Whitaker, hoping to build a new life, free from circumstances he hadn't actually created himself. So he wasn't a criminal, Eleanor said slowly. He was a man trying to escape his own father's irresponsibility. Precisely, Carter confirmed. Mrs. Hale's investigators apparently uncovered the surface details, the name change, the unpaid debts, without fully understanding the actual circumstances behind them. She assumed the worst, believing the connection alone would prove embarrassing regardless of the deeper truth. Eleanor felt tears finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure, though these tears carried something different than the devastation she'd experienced months earlier, something closer to vindication, to relief, to finally understanding her own family's history with complete clarity rather than assumption. My father was protecting our family, she said, not deceiving anyone, simply trying to build something honest after his own father's failures. It appears that way, Carter confirmed gently. Eleanor wrote to her mother that evening, carefully explaining everything she'd learned, uncertain how her mother would respond to decades-old secrets suddenly surfacing through such unexpected circumstances. Her mother's response arrived 2 weeks later, the familiar handwriting carrying both relief and lingering grief. Eleanor, I wondered for years whether this history would eventually surface. Your father carried tremendous shame regarding his own father's abandonment, believing somehow that changing our name represented dishonesty, rather than simply protecting our family from circumstances entirely beyond our control. He passed before you were old enough to understand these complications, and I made the difficult choice to let that history remain buried rather than burden you with shame that was never rightfully yours to carry. I'm sorry you learned the truth through such painful circumstances, but I hope now that you understand completely. You can find peace, knowing your father's choices reflected resilience and integrity, not the deception others apparently assumed. Eleanor read the letter multiple times, feeling old grief mixing with new understanding, finally comprehending fully the man her father had been. Not perfect, not without complicated history, but fundamentally honest in his efforts to build something stable, despite circumstances that would have broken many others entirely. The revelation about her father's history eventually became public knowledge, Margaret's attorney apparently leaking details to journalists in a transparent attempt to shift public sympathy away from his client's deliberate cruelty toward suggesting Eleanor herself had somehow deceived Virginia society regarding her family's background. The strategy backfired entirely. Rather than damaging Eleanor's reputation, the full story, properly investigated and accurately reported by more reputable newspapers, painted a portrait of genuine resilience. A young woman who had built skill and reputation entirely through her own merit. Despite her father's complicated history, who had maintained dignity throughout devastating public humiliation, who had ultimately achieved professional success precisely because of character forged through difficult circumstances rather than inherited privilege. The narrative has shifted considerably in your favor. Ashford observed one afternoon several newspapers spread across his desk, each one now framing Eleanor's story with considerably more sympathy and admiration than the earlier coverage had offered. I never wanted any of this attention, Eleanor said, though she recognized something different in her own reaction, now less distress at public scrutiny, more quiet satisfaction. That truth eventually tended toward vindication when given sufficient time and proper investigation. Public attention rarely arrives conveniently, Ashford replied. But you've demonstrated through this entire ordeal exactly the kind of integrity our preservation work requires. I believe this renewed public interest may actually benefit our broader mission considerably, drawing attention to historical preservation efforts that typically struggle to capture public imagination. Margaret's marriage. Eleanor learned through subsequent correspondence, ultimately did not survive the revelation of her mother's manipulation. Her husband apparently unable to reconcile himself to marrying into a family capable of such calculated cruelty, regardless of who had originated the actual instruction. Mrs. Hale, facing mounting public scrutiny following the revelation of her own role in orchestrating the Vale's destruction, found herself increasingly isolated within Virginia society. Former friends and business associates distancing themselves from association with a family whose reputation had suffered such thorough public collapse. Eleanor felt no particular satisfaction reading these updates, though she recognized something like closure settling through her chest. Not vindictive triumph, but simply the quiet recognition that consequences, however delayed, eventually arrived for choices made without genuine accountability. As winter deepened further, Eleanor received notification that the Preservation Society's current restoration director had officially announced retirement, the position Ashford had previously mentioned now becoming formally available. I'd like to nominate you, Ashford told her directly, sitting across from her desk one cold December afternoon. Your work over these past months has exceeded every expectation we held when first offering you employment. Your technical skill combined with the genuine philosophy you bring to preservation work makes you precisely the candidate this office requires. Eleanor felt overwhelming gratitude mixing with genuine nervousness at the prospect. I'm honored, she said, though I confess some uncertainty whether I possess sufficient experience for such significant responsibility. Experience can be developed, Ashford replied. Character and instinct, the qualities you've demonstrated throughout this entire difficult year, prove considerably harder to teach. I have complete confidence you'll excel in this position. Eleanor accepted the nomination, feeling the weight of genuine professional achievement settling into something that felt entirely earned, built through her own demonstrated skill and integrity, rather than inherited privilege or marriage, into prominent social standing. The official appointment arrived in early January, a formal letter bearing the Preservation Office's seal naming Eleanor Whitaker as Director of Restoration for the National Textile Preservation Office, effective immediately. Eleanor held the letter for a long moment before allowing herself to fully absorb what it meant, the weight of the title settling onto shoulders that had spent an entire year learning slowly and painfully that her worth had never depended on anyone else's approval. "You've earned every word of that letter," Caroline said, reading over her shoulder, genuine pride evident in her voice. "I remember the woman who arrived here last summer, carrying nothing but a torn fragment of veil and considerable uncertainty about her own future. Look at you now." "I couldn't have arrived here alone," Eleanor said. "You, Ashford, Carter, Mrs. Aldridge, all of you saw something in me I'd nearly forgotten existed. We simply recognized what was always there," Caroline corrected gently. "We didn't create your skill or your resilience, Eleanor. We just refused to let circumstances obscure it any longer." Her first official act as director involved expanding the Preservation Society's outreach efforts beyond Washington, establishing satellite operations in Philadelphia, Charleston, and after considerable internal deliberation, Richmond itself, despite the complicated history that location carried for her personally. "Are you certain about Richmond?" Ashford asked during their planning meeting, his expression carrying genuine concern. "Given everything that occurred in Virginia, I'd understand entirely if you preferred avoiding that particular region." "That's precisely why it matters," Eleanor replied. "If I allow personal history to dictate where preservation work happens, I'm allowing the Hale family's cruelty to continue limiting my choices long after they've faced their own consequences. Richmond needs preservation expertise regardless of my complicated personal history there." Ashford nodded slowly, clearly impressed by her reasoning. "That's precisely the kind of leadership this position requires." The Richmond satellite office opened in early spring, Eleanor traveling personally to oversee its establishment, the irony of returning to Virginia in a position of genuine authority not lost on her as she walked through streets that had once represented nothing but humiliation and erasure. During her visit, she received an unexpected request, a formal invitation to speak before the Virginia Historical Society regarding preservation efforts, an invitation that would require her to address an audience likely populated by individuals who had witnessed her devastating wedding scandal firsthand. "You don't have to accept," Carter told her, having traveled to Richmond himself, to assist with the new office's federal coordination requirements. "No one would think less of you for declining given the circumstances." "I think I need to accept," Eleanor said. "Not for them, but for myself. I spent 3 weeks in this state making myself smaller, quieter, more accommodating to people who fundamentally despised my presence. I think it's time I stood before this same society as exactly who I actually am, rather than who I tried to become, to earn their approval." The evening of her address arrived with considerable nervousness, fluttering beneath Eleanor's composed exterior, the Historical Society's grand hall filling with Virginia's prominent families, many of whom she recognized immediately upon entering, had attended her aborted wedding ceremony nearly a year earlier. She scanned the gathering crowd and felt her breath catch slightly upon recognizing Mrs. Hale, seated near the back, considerably more subdued than Eleanor remembered her once confident posture, now carrying visible weight from months of social isolation and diminished standing. Jonathan, she noted with surprise, was also present, seated several rows from his mother, their distance from each other suggesting estrangement that had apparently deepened considerably since his honest testimony months earlier. Eleanor took her place at the podium, feeling the weight of dozens of curious, judgmental, and occasionally sympathetic eyes settling upon her. "Thank you for the invitation to address this distinguished gathering." She began, her voice carrying steady confidence, despite the considerable history weighing upon this particular room. "I understand many of you witnessed certain dramatic circumstances surrounding my previous visit to Virginia. I won't pretend that history doesn't exist between myself and this community." A murmur rippled through the crowd, surprised by her direct acknowledgement of the scandal everyone clearly remembered, but few had expected her to address publicly. "But I'm here tonight," Eleanor continued, "not to discuss personal grievances, but to discuss something considerably more important: the urgent necessity of preserving our nation's textile heritage before further pieces are lost to neglect fire, or—" She paused deliberately. Deliberate destruction. She watched several faces in the crowd shift uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the implicit reference to her own devastating experience. 6 generations from now," Eleanor continued, "when historians attempt to understand how early American families lived, what they valued, what stories their hands wove into fabric meant to last centuries, that understanding depends entirely on choices we make today regarding preservation. Every piece destroyed through carelessness or cruelty represents a permanent loss to historical understanding that future generations will never fully recover." She spoke for nearly an hour, detailing specific restoration projects, explaining technical methodology, sharing stories of textiles she had personally preserved that carried historical significance far beyond their physical materials. As her address concluded, applause filled the hall, genuine sustained applause that Eleanor recognized as something considerably different from polite courtesy. "Miss Whitaker," came a voice, as she stepped down from the podium, and Eleanor turned to find an elderly gentleman approaching his expression carrying genuine admiration. "Senator William Hartley, I confess I attended this evening specifically curious whether the scandal surrounding your previous visit would overshadow your professional credibility. Instead, I find myself thoroughly impressed by both your expertise and your evident character." "Thank you, Senator," Eleanor said. "I serve on a congressional committee currently reviewing federal funding allocations for historical preservation." Hartley continued, "I believe your testimony before that committee regarding the practical necessity of expanded preservation efforts could prove considerably influential in securing additional resources for work like yours." Eleanor felt genuine surprise at this unexpected opportunity. "I would be honored to provide such testimony." As the evening's reception continued, Eleanor found herself unexpectedly approached by Mrs. Hale, the older woman's expression carrying none of the composed superiority Eleanor remembered from their previous encounters. "Miss Whitaker," Mrs. Hale said quietly, "might I have a moment?" Eleanor hesitated, old instincts warring against newer ones before finally nodding. "I won't pretend our history allows for easy conversation," Mrs. Hale began, "but I wanted you to know I've heard about your testimony before Congress about the Richmond office, about everything you've built since leaving our estate." "Why does that concern you?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying careful neutrality. "Because I orchestrated your destruction," Mrs. Hale said, her voice finally breaking slightly. "I discovered information about your father, panicked about potential embarrassment to my own family's reputation, and instructed my daughter to destroy something precious, specifically to drive you away before that information could become public. I did this without ever considering the genuine cruelty involved, without considering you as an actual person with history and dignity worth protecting." Eleanor studied her carefully, recognizing genuine remorse, finally breaking through years of calculated social performance. "And now?" Eleanor prompted. "Now I watch you stand before this entire society, addressing the very people who witnessed your humiliation, speaking with confidence and expertise that none of us anticipated you possessed," Mrs. Hale said. "I watch my own family's reputation crumble, while yours rises specifically because of choices we made attempting to destroy you. There's a particular kind of justice in that I find difficult to fully process." "I didn't rise because of your cruelty," Eleanor said firmly. "I rose despite it. There's an important difference, Mrs. Hale. Your family's actions nearly destroyed something irreplaceable, nearly erased my dignity entirely. The fact that I found strength to rebuild afterward doesn't excuse what you attempted to do." "I understand that," Mrs. Hale said. "I'm not seeking absolution, Miss Whitaker. I simply needed you to know that I recognize fully now what I failed to recognize then, that cruelty, regardless of motivation or justification, eventually generates consequences considerably more devastating than whatever you initially hoped to avoid. Eleanor absorbed this acknowledgement, feeling something complicated settling through her chest. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. But perhaps the beginning of genuine closure. I hope you find whatever peace remains available to you, Eleanor said finally. But I won't pretend our history allows for friendship, Mrs. Hale. Some bridges once burned thoroughly enough simply cannot be rebuilt. Mrs. Hale nodded slowly, accepting this boundary without protest before quietly withdrawing from the conversation. Jonathan approached shortly afterward, his expression carrying visible nervousness as he navigated the crowded reception toward where Eleanor stood near the room's edge. "You were remarkable tonight," he said simply. "Thank you. I've followed your career through newspapers," Jonathan continued. "The Richmond office, the upcoming congressional testimony, you've built something genuinely extraordinary from circumstances that nearly destroyed you entirely." "I built it myself," Eleanor said, not unkindly, but with quiet firmness. "Through my own skill, my own choices separate entirely from anyone else's validation or support." Jonathan absorbed this something like genuine respect, mixing with lingering regret in his expression. "I think about that morning often," he admitted. "About the choice I made, choosing my family's comfort over your dignity. I've spent the past year trying to understand how I allowed myself to fail someone I genuinely cared for so completely." "Have you found understanding?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious despite herself. "I think," Jonathan said slowly, "I spent my entire life prioritizing comfort over conviction, choosing whatever path required least resistance rather than whatever path actually aligned with my genuine values. That morning simply revealed a pattern I'd been avoiding acknowledging for years. And now I'm trying to build something different," Jonathan said. "I've relocated to Boston, started my own shipping venture entirely separate from my father's business, attempting to build success based on my own merit rather than inherited privilege and family connections." Eleanor felt something unexpected. Not romantic longing, that particular feeling had genuinely faded entirely. But perhaps something closer to hope that Jonathan might eventually become someone capable of genuine integrity, separate from the man who had failed her so completely a year earlier. "I wish you success in that endeavor," Eleanor said sincerely. "Is there any possibility," Jonathan began carefully, "that we might eventually—" "No," Eleanor interrupted gently but firmly. "Jonathan, I genuinely hope you build a meaningful life separate from your family's complicated legacy. But what we had cannot be reconstructed. I'm not the same woman who arrived at your family's estate believing marriage represented the only path towards security and worth. I've discovered considerably more substantial foundations for that worth through my own work, my own choices." Jonathan nodded slowly, accepting this with visible disappointment but apparent understanding. "I hope you find genuine happiness, Eleanor," he said. "You deserve considerably more than what I was capable of offering." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "I believe I have found it actually, simply not in the form I once imagined." Eleanor's congressional testimony, delivered 3 weeks later before the committee, Senator Hartley chaired, proved considerably more influential than even she had anticipated. She spoke with detailed expertise about preservation methodology, about the irreplaceable historical value embedded within textiles that careless families and inadequate funding allowed to deteriorate or face deliberate destruction without consequence. "The veil destroyed in my own personal circumstances," she told the assembled committee, "represented 3 generations of my family's history, my grandmother's hands, my mother's careful preservation, my own restoration efforts spanning 6 months of dedicated work. That single incident, while deeply personal, illustrates a broader pattern occurring across this young nation. Countless similar artifacts face destruction through neglect, ignorance, or deliberate cruelty, with current federal protections proving inadequate to prevent such losses or ensure meaningful consequences when they occur. Her testimony, combined with detailed statistical evidence regarding preservation needs across the eastern seaboard, resulted in the committee unanimously recommending substantially increased federal funding for the National Textile Preservation Office, along with expanded legal protections for registered historical artifacts. "You've accomplished something genuinely remarkable," Ashford told her following the testimony's successful conclusion. "Securing this level of funding increase typically requires years of advocacy. You achieved it through a single compelling testimony." "I simply told the truth about what genuine loss feels like," Eleanor replied. "Apparently, that truth carried more weight than I initially anticipated." As summer approached once more, nearly a full year since the devastating morning that had irrevocably altered Eleanor's entire life trajectory, she found herself reflecting on the considerable distance she had traveled, not merely geographically from Virginia to Washington and back again, but emotionally and professionally, from a woman whose worth depended entirely on others' approval toward someone who had built genuine security through her own demonstrated skill and unwavering integrity. She returned to Philadelphia briefly that summer, visiting her mother, who had relocated to a modest but comfortable home. Eleanor's increased salary now allowed her to provide. "You seem different," her mother observed during their visit, echoing Caroline's earlier sentiment from months before. "Stronger somehow. More certain of yourself than I've ever witnessed." "I think I finally understand something I spent years failing to recognize," Eleanor said. "My worth was never dependent on marriage, on social acceptance, on anyone else's validation. It existed entirely within my own skill, my own choices, my own resilience through difficult circumstances." "Your grandmother would be proud," her mother said quietly. She always believed Whitaker women carried strength considerably deeper than circumstances might suggest. Eleanor thought of the torn veil fragment she still kept carefully preserved, now displayed prominently in her Washington office, rather than hidden away as a symbol of shame or loss. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, "about commissioning a new piece. Something that incorporates the surviving fragments from grandmother's veil into an entirely new design, not attempting to recreate what was destroyed, but creating something different that honors both the loss and everything I've built since." Her mother smiled, genuine warmth filling her expression. "I think that sounds exactly right." The new piece, completed over several careful months, became something Eleanor considered her most personally significant restoration project. Not a wedding veil this time, but a wall hanging, incorporating the surviving lace fragments alongside newer fabric. The design itself representing continuity through transformation, history honored through evolution rather than rigid preservation alone. She displayed it prominently within the Preservation Office's main hall, where visitors and staff alike could observe the careful integration of old and new fragile lace patterns from her grandmother's original work, interwoven with sturdier, more contemporary fabric that ensured the piece's longevity for generations beyond her own lifetime. "It's remarkable," Caroline observed, examining the completed work with genuine admiration. "You've taken something destroyed through cruelty and transformed it into something considerably more meaningful than the original could have ever represented alone. That's rather the entire philosophy behind preservation work," Eleanor replied. "Understanding that history isn't simply about maintaining things exactly as they once existed, but about honoring their significance while allowing necessary evolution and growth." "You're speaking about more than fabric now," Caroline observed perceptively. Eleanor smiled, recognizing the truth in her friend's observation. "Perhaps I am." That autumn, nearly 14 months after the devastating morning that had begun this entire journey, Eleanor received an unexpected visit from Marshall Carter, who arrived at the Washington office carrying news of his own significant transition. "I've accepted a permanent position here in Washington," he told her, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Overseeing federal preservation enforcement more broadly, rather than simply responding to individual incidents as they arise." "That's wonderful news," Eleanor said, genuine pleasure evident in her voice. "Washington will benefit considerably from your continued involvement." "I confess," Carter continued, his expression carrying unexpected nervousness Eleanor hadn't previously witnessed from him. Washington wasn't the only consideration driving this particular decision. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken slightly, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "I've spent considerable time over this past year," Carter continued, "reflecting on circumstances surrounding our initial meeting, on everything you've subsequently built through remarkable skill and unwavering integrity. I find myself genuinely admiring not simply your professional accomplishments, but your fundamental character throughout incredibly difficult circumstances." Marshall Carter. "Gideon," he corrected gently. "I believe, given everything we've experienced together throughout this past year, formal titles seem somewhat unnecessary between us now." "Gideon," Eleanor repeated, feeling warmth spreading through her chest, despite considerable surprise at this unexpected direction. "I'm not attempting to suggest anything beyond genuine friendship, should that be your preference," Gideon continued carefully. "But I wanted you to know that my admiration for you extends considerably beyond simple professional respect. I find myself genuinely hoping our continued acquaintance might eventually develop into something deeper, should you feel similarly inclined." Eleanor studied him carefully, recognizing genuine vulnerability beneath his typically composed federal authority, remembering his steady presence throughout her most devastating circumstances, his unwavering commitment to ensuring genuine justice, rather than convenient settlement. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, feeling her own vulnerability rising to meet his, "I would genuinely welcome discovering where such continued acquaintance might eventually lead." Gideon's expression brightened considerably, genuine relief and happiness evident in features Eleanor had only previously witnessed maintaining careful federal composure. "Might I invite you to dinner this evening then?" he asked. Properly this time, rather than simply discussing case developments over hurried conversations. Eleanor smiled, feeling genuine joy bloom through her chest for what felt like the first time in considerable years. "I would like that very much." As winter arrived once more, bringing with it the second anniversary of that devastating morning when her grandmother's veil had been torn apart in front of her eyes, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable distance she had traveled. She now served as Director of Restoration for an organization whose congressional funding had increased substantially through her own testimony and advocacy. She had established satellite offices across 3 major cities, training the next generation of preservation specialists in techniques she had developed through years of independent dedication. She had built genuine friendship with Caroline Webb, genuine respect from colleagues like Ashford, who recognized her expertise without requiring social pedigree or marriage into prominent families. And now walking beside Gideon Carter through Washington's snow-dusted streets, their courtship having developed naturally over recent months into something Eleanor recognized as considerably more substantial than what she had once mistaken for love with Jonathan Hale, she felt genuine peace settling through her entire being. "You're quiet," Gideon observed, noticing her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about everything that's happened since that morning," Eleanor admitted. "How devastating it felt at the time, how completely it seemed to destroy everything I believed my future would contain. And now I understand that mourning, despite its genuine cruelty, ultimately revealed exactly the life I was meant to build, one based on my own skill, my own integrity, my own choices, rather than dependence on someone else's approval or acceptance." Gideon reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining gently with hers as they continued walking through the cold evening air. "I'm grateful," he said quietly, "that circumstances brought us together even through such painful means." "As am I," Eleanor agreed. "Though I confess I wouldn't wish that particular morning's devastation on anyone else, regardless of whatever positive circumstances eventually emerged from it." "No," Gideon agreed. "But perhaps that's precisely the nature of genuine resilience, finding strength and purpose, even through circumstances we would never willingly choose, building something meaningful from destruction that initially seemed entirely without redemption." Eleanor squeezed his hand gently, feeling complete certainty settle through her chest, regarding everything she had built, everything she had become, everything still waiting to unfold in the considerable future, stretching ahead of them both. "I stopped trying to be accepted by people who never truly valued me," she said softly, echoing sentiments she'd carried throughout this entire transformative year. "I started trying to be seen, truly seen, for exactly who I actually am. And what I see?" Gideon replied, stopping to face her directly, his expression carrying genuine warmth and admiration, "is a woman of remarkable strength, extraordinary skill, and unwavering integrity. Someone who transformed devastating cruelty into genuine purpose, who built something meaningful from circumstances designed specifically to destroy her." Eleanor felt tears of genuine joy rather than grief gathering in her eyes, recognizing finally completely that everything she had endured throughout that devastating year had ultimately led her toward exactly the life she had always deserved. One built on authentic recognition rather than desperate accommodation, on genuine partnership rather than tolerated presence, on unwavering self-respect that no amount of cruelty or destruction could ever again diminish. The torn veil that had once represented her greatest devastation now rested transformed within her. Washington office, its surviving fragments woven into something new, something stronger, something that honored both the loss she had endured and the remarkable strength she had discovered through surviving it. She was no longer the woman who had stood frozen watching her grandmother's veil torn apart by cruel hands. She had become someone considerably more powerful, a woman who had learned through devastating circumstances exactly what genuine worth, genuine strength, and genuine love actually required. And standing beside Gideon Carter, beneath Washington's winter sky, Eleanor Whitaker finally understood that her story, despite its devastating beginning, had ultimately become one of complete and unwavering triumph.